Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case about a man. A man who wanted other people, or who wants other people to pay for his own mistakes rather than suffering for them himself. A man who wants the police department and Officer Waldman to pay for his mistake of assaulting Officer Levy. You see, the plaintiff, Mr. Ramirez, he was at a party with his friends. He was at one of his friends' house, and they were having a good time. They were watching an NBA game, and they shared a six-pack among themselves. And then they went. When the game finished, they decided to go and play rummy. After they had finished the rummy game, they decided it would be a really great idea to go to the bars around the city to have a bit of a spice to the evening, I suppose. And so they left and went to the bars. Now, while they went to a couple of different bars, and at each one they had a drink or two of scotch and whiskey, and then they decided at about 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. in the morning to go for a run in the park in the middle of the night. So they went down to the park and they had their race, and then they decided it was time to go home, and they left. Now, they left to go back to the house of man who they were having the party with, and Mr. Ramirez picked up his car from there and started driving back to his own home. And at this point in the story, I'll pick up from where Officer Waldman and Levy, where their story starts from. Well, Officer Levy and Waldman were working for the Chicago Police Department. They had been called out to a case that had been a suspected burglary case, or an attempted burglary, and they were slowly driving around the roads around that house to see where they could find a suspect, or to see where there are any suspicious characters around. So they were driving along, probably about maybe 10 miles per hour, or just a little under that, or maybe a little over. But around that, just so they could have plenty of time to see any person on the side of the road. Now, when they were doing this, suddenly a car pulled up behind them and started flashing its lights, obviously wanting to get past. However, there was plenty of space for them to go around Officer Levy and Waldman, because after all it was 3 a.m. and the traffic was probably almost non-existent. However, the car didn't go past and started honking its horn, obviously wanting to get past. So Officer Levy and Waldman pulled their car over to the side of the road so that the other car could go past. However, the other car, instead of going past, stopped beside them. And the man, who you've probably guessed by now was Mr. Ramirez, the plaintiff, he started yelling at the police officers. Then he jumped out of the car and started running around his car to get to the officer's car. In the meantime, Officer Levy had got out of his seat and had stood up by the side of the road when he saw Mr. Ramirez running at him with the knife. He shouted, "Police, police," because they were in an unmarked police car and they weren't in uniform, so Mr. Ramirez wouldn't have known that they were police. He shouted, "Police, police," but Mr. Ramirez didn't stop and kept on coming. Well, Officer Waldman, who was sitting obviously beside Officer Levy, he saw Mr. Ramirez coming to attack Officer Levy, and he saw Mr. Ramirez raise the knife and stab Officer Levy. So he quickly jumped out of the car and raced around to the other side of the car, and there he saw Mr. Ramirez had his hand up with the knife. Like this, about to stab Officer Levy. Officer Levy's hands were both clutching the right hand of Mr. Ramirez, trying to stop the blade from coming down and stabbing him. But Officer Waldman thought that Officer Levy's grasp on that hand was slipping, and that Mr. Ramirez was going to stab Officer Levy. So he did the only thing that he thought he could do to stop his partner from getting stabbed. He grabbed his gun and shot Mr. Ramirez. Now, Officer Waldman was obviously extremely upset, as everyone would be if they just had to shoot a man, and he quickly rang for backup in an ambulance. And when they came to the scene, they saw Mr. Ramirez and lying on the ground, obviously where he'd been shot, and a knife closed beside him. Now, both Mr. Ramirez and Officer Waldman had to be taken to the hospital for treatment. Officer Levy had to be taken to the hospital for treatment, and his wound was only slight. It got patched up fairly easily, but Mr. Ramirez had to have a lengthy stay in hospital and obviously recover from that injury, and he still hasn't properly got his full strength back, and he's still not able to work properly. The opposing counsel will tell you that there are many, that there's a different perspective to the case. That, for one, the knife that was found on the scene of the crime was a lockback knife. Now, a lockback knife locks in place when it's fully open. So there's no way that just by dropping this knife could you make the blade go back. However, the knife was found on the scene of the crime closed. They'll also tell you that the blade that Mr. Ramirez was left-handed. Well, the officers both stated that Mr. Ramirez was stabbed Officer Levy and the knife was held in his right hand. However, the knife was still found on the scene of the crime. And it is for you to decide, ladies and gentlemen, whether you should allow Mr. Ramirez to make the police department and Officer Waldman pay for his mistakes. His mistakes of driving after he had drunk so much in the bars and in the party where they were watching the NBA game. Also, his bad decision of, instead of just driving past the police officers, stopping and shouting abuse at them. And for the even greater mistake of taking out his knife and stabbing Officer Levy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.